Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to have a look at this charcoal portrait of Jack Nicholson. Some people wanted to see it, so here it is. Let's have a look. It's going to be a somewhat larger portrait in the sense that the face is covering much of the paper, but the paper itself is not huge. It's 9 times 12 inches as usual. I'm doing the sketch with a graphite pencil, and I may use the graphite pencil a little bit later on his shed, but other than that, pretty much all of it is going to be done, or most of it is going to be done in charcoal. And I'm going to be using a combination of charcoal pencils and vine charcoal. Jack Nicholson is a great actor, many great movies. Just the other night I saw one of his comedies, Anger Management, with Adam Sandler. It's a pretty good movie. After the sketch, I'm moving on with charcoal pencil, and I'm using a pencil holder here because my charcoal pencil is almost spent, but it's a medium charcoal pencil, and I'm going to do most of the work with it. And I'm using a tortillon to soften the edges just a little bit, so that the hair would look a little more realistic. But anyway, I'm mostly using a tapered stroke here, and I'm laying down the basic strokes which will later become his hair. And here you can see a little bit closer what I'm doing. I'm basically using this tapered stroke to shade from one side to the other, from the darker areas to the lighter areas in the middle, and I'm leaving the lighter area in the middle almost completely white. But it's not going to remain completely white, because once I start shading, blending rather, with a brush, I'm going to be pushing the charcoal from the darker areas to the lighter areas in the middle, and that way I will create nice transitions from the darker areas to the lighter areas, and hopefully, because of the use of a brush, those transitions will be very soft and seamless, and I will be creating some nice highlights in the process, and later I can go back and pull some additional highlights or take away a little bit more of the value using erasers if I feel like some parts of that hair need to be even lighter, because his hair is slicked back, so naturally some parts of it are going to appear a little bit shiny or reflective, so I am going to be using my eraser a little bit later just to pull some highlights on the hair. But so far it's looking pretty good. Like I said, it's very important to use a tapered stroke and to draw the hair in the direction in which it's combed or slicked back in this case, so that once you start blending, that texture looks just right. And here I also added a touch of soft charcoal pencil to make the hair a little bit darker in some areas, and I did the same thing on the ear, on the darkest portions of the ear. Naturally, I use the soft charcoal pencil very sparingly because it's quite a bit darker than the medium charcoal pencil, and I do most of the work with a medium charcoal pencil. It's just that I use that soft charcoal pencil for the extra dark areas to give myself an additional range of value, so that I can create more volume and depth in my drawings. So I'm working on the eye on the left, and now I'm going to do the eyebrows, which are one of the most characteristic or one of the most peculiar things about Jack Nicholson's face. So I need to get those right. I need to get those right in order to capture the likeness. But of course, capturing the likeness and getting the face to look right is a process that's going to take a little bit of time, and there's no point in rushing it. There are a couple of things which will be making my job a little bit more difficult, because there are some shadows under the eyebrows, in the eye sockets, and also I'm going to need to shade the right side of the face, or his left side of the face, a little bit more, because my light source is coming more from the left side. So the left side is going to be the light side, and the right side is going to be the shadow side. Naturally, the light source is always coming more from above, or is usually coming from above, but it's usually coming from one side more than the other. So in this case, it's going to be more from the left side, and the shadows are going to be on the right side. And I'm going to have some highlights or some lighter portions on his face, on the forehead and on the nose and on the cheekbones. But here you can see again, I'm using a tapered stroke using a medium charcoal pencil to shade his face. I'm doing some initial shading, but I did it rather carelessly because it's all going to be blended in, so I don't really care too much if there's a lot of texture here. Right now it looks like a bit of a mess, but that's the way it is when you work in charcoal. Right now I'm focusing on the other eye, and there's going to be a tiny reflection in the eye there, a tiny highlight. I'm going to pull a small one in the other eye as well. But the key to making these reflections stand out a little bit more is shading the entire eye, including the whites of the eye, and that way the reflection is allowed to stand out. I'm also going to draw a little bit of the lower eyelashes here. And I'm moving on to the other eyebrow. Eyebrows can be a little bit tricky. So like I said, Jack Nicholson has very interesting looking eyebrows, but one of the things that's kind of always a challenge when drawing eyebrows on deep set eyes is that in your reference photos it can be a little bit difficult to discern the shadows from the hair, from the actual eyebrows. The reference photo that I'm working on is not of great quality. It's not really high res. That's why I'm using another reference photo to study his face a little bit more. Both of the reference photos are from the same movie. I use the reference photos, or rather the movie stills from the movie As Good As It Gets. So I did much of the forehead now, and I think I created some nice transitions between the lighter and darker areas. And I'm just doing some additional shading around these wrinkles on his forehead. I'm also going to need to use the pencil eraser to deepen those wrinkles a little bit, to give them more of a 3D look. And now I'm using vine charcoal. As you can see, I'm using vine charcoal to put some additional value in some of the shadow areas. But the good thing about vine charcoal is that it can be blended very easily, so it's very easy for me to just draw a couple of these lines, and then even though it looks like a mess, it all gets blended in very easily. And the good thing, another good thing about vine charcoal is that it also allows me to create smoother transitions with compressed charcoal as well. So vine charcoal is very good to use in combination with charcoal pencils. And you can slowly see how that ugly texture that I initially created through the initial shading process is now disappearing, and I will gradually be making the skin look a little more natural. But the shading process and the texturing process will take a little bit of time. Right now I'm using a tortillon to work a little bit around the eye on the right. And you can also use a tortillon as a drawing tool in some cases, and the reason why you would want to use a tortillon as a drawing tool is because it can sometimes do some things that charcoal pencil won't do. For example, create smoother, lighter lines, and a charcoal pencil will usually create darker marks, darker lines with a lot more texture. So one of the ways to avoid that is to use tortillon. Tortillon with a little bit of charcoal on it can be used not only for shading but also for sketching. When you want to work on some facial features but you're not really sure about putting down the charcoal pencil marks. So here I did a little bit more work on the mouth and the nose. And you can see that as I've shaded the upper portion of his head, the forehead and around the eyes, that the hair started to appear a little bit lighter. And you're going to see the same effect with the mouth and the lips. So once I start shading the lips will appear a little bit too dark. But once I shade the rest of the face around them, they won't appear as dark. And now the hair appears a little bit lighter because I've done a lot more shading on the face, and that's why I'm going to be adding a little bit more value to the hair, because I want the hair to be a little bit darker, because in the movie where I took the references from, his hair still wasn't grey, so it was a little bit darker. I did a little bit of shading on the nose, mostly using a tortillon, and I tried to leave that lighter portion of the nose and to shade the sides of the nose so that I can show the shape of it a little bit better. And now I'm putting down a little bit more charcoal and doing a little more shading on the right side of the face using a medium charcoal pencil, because like I said, the right side of the face needs to be the shadow side in my portrait. And a couple more wrinkles here around the eyes. I'm also using a brush to soften all of that texture that I'm creating, because there's too many lines there and I want to soften those lines, because obviously otherwise the skin and the portrait won't look very realistic. And I still have a lot of work to do around the mouth, because it doesn't look very convincing at all. So still a lot of work to be done there. So that's the way it is when you're shading in charcoal. Some parts of that process can be a little bit messy and a little bit upsetting, but you have to get used to it. People who are used to working in graphite are probably used to working in a much slower pace, but also a much more controlled manner, because with graphite you have a lot more control over the amount of value you're building in certain areas. With charcoal, things are a little bit different, and often you can produce a lot more value in some areas. Some parts of the face will end up being a lot darker in that process, and you will find yourself either shading around those darker areas, or taking away a little bit of the value, picking up a little bit of the charcoal from those darker areas in order to make them lighter. And now I'm using a soft charcoal pencil to add some more dark value to the hair, because I want the hair to be darker. It ended up looking a little bit too light in comparison to the face, because I've done a lot of shading on the face and I put down quite a bit of value on it. So right now I've added a little bit of soft charcoal to make the hair darker, but not all over the hair, just on some of the areas where I would expect a little more shadow. And then I use the brush to push that darker charcoal and blend it with the lighter areas, and I think the hair is starting to look a little bit better now. But I'm also using a Q-tip in addition to the brushes to soften the texture on the face. And I'm doing some additional shading because I felt like some of the areas on the face were just a little bit too light, like I kind of almost forgot to shade some portions of the face. So I'm kind of taking care of that right now, and adding a little more shadow under the jaw and on the sides of the face. It's very important to put down enough value on the sides of the face, because if you don't do that, the face will end up looking a little bit flat and therefore too broad. Here I used a little bit more of the vine charcoal to add even more value to the right side of the face and to the lower part of the face and on the neck, because I felt like the neck needed to be even darker because there's mostly shadow there, and the upper part of the face and the upper part of the head, especially the forehead, is getting a lot more light because, like I said, in most cases the light source is coming from above. And I think I created a nice highlight on his forehead on the left, and I have a nice transition between the areas of lighter and darker value there, but I'm probably gonna want to do a little bit more shading and add a little more texture in that area. And I'm just refining the hair a little bit more, adding a touch more of that soft charcoal pencil because I felt like I needed even more depth. And I'm doing that with some other areas, just using that soft charcoal pencil sparingly and just adding a touch of it in some areas of my portrait to give myself a greater range of value. But if I feel like I put down a little bit too much of it in some areas, I can always remove that with a pencil eraser. The pencil eraser I'm using is a Kohinoor pencil eraser, and in most cases I prefer to use that over the kneaded eraser, even though in some cases I use a kneaded eraser. I usually combine the use of these two, and in portraits like this one I tend to use the pencil eraser mostly for cleaning up or lifting up larger areas of charcoal, but most of the time I use this pencil eraser. As for the brand of the pencils, it's mostly Worse and Woodless charcoal pencils or Kohinoor charcoal pencils. Those are usually the brands that I'm using. And here and there I can also use a black colored pencil to work on some details and to create some textures on the face, or maybe to make some of the shading on the face a little bit smoother so that I can get a more realistic appearance of the skin. And here I used a pencil eraser to lift up some of the charcoal and create some highlights, as well as deepen these wrinkles a little bit. I added some highlights on the nose and the cheekbones, and now I think the topography of the face is really starting to show up, and it's really starting to look like Jack Nicholson, and not just look like Jack Nicholson, it's starting to look like a real three-dimensional face that's popping out of the paper, which was ultimately my goal. You can see how much value you need to put down in order to create a nice looking portrait. You need a great range of value, and you need to make sure that you cover almost all of the face in the shading process. Only very tiny areas can remain lighter and almost white, but most of it has to be shaded if you want to create an illusion of volume. Here I did a little bit of sketching on his shirt, and now I'm moving on to shading it. I'm really not going to do too much to it because it's just a simple shirt with a white t-shirt under it. I think I'm just doing what I can based on my reference photo. The shirt has a pattern which I'm also going to try to draw, but like I said, I don't plan to putting too much work or effort into it. It's going to be a vignette like the vast majority of my portraits, and I always like to focus more on the face itself, and I just tend to simplify the clothes. I did add a little bit of more of charcoal on the shirt to create a little more depth, especially around the collar. But I'm just using a graphite pencil to create some suggestions of that pattern on the shirt. But I'm mostly done with that, and I'm just putting down some finishing touches on the face. Basically, going over some of the areas which I felt needed a little bit more shading and a little bit more shadow. I felt like I needed a little more shadow under the nose, under the lower lip, under the chin, because that's where you would get some cast shadow. And I decided to sign my drawing in the lower right corner, and I was almost thinking about finishing the portrait, but I felt like fidgeting with it just a little bit more. I made some adjustments around the eyes and the mouth, and I did a little bit of additional cleaning up. So signing the portrait is not always the final step. Sometimes I put down a few more strokes once I sign the portrait just to make a few more adjustments, but it's usually nothing too big. I think the portrait is done now. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other portraits, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.